Marisha here, and I'm going to be reacting to another MSN UK article. This one entitled Why Americans Love Brits 21 Charming Traits. And for the sake of brevity, I'm actually going to break this up into three different videos. So I'm only going to be covering the first 7 traits in this video. And let's just dive right in. And keep in mind, this was written by a Brit, so it's their perception of what they think Americans find charming. And I, as an American, I'm going to chime in on whether I agree or not. Number one, our exotic accents. They did put exotic in quotation marks unnecessarily because it's not exotic, it is exotic. I mean, by definition, because it's not our accent, it is a foreign accent, it is exotic. I do have some issues with some of the writing in this article, and I may mention some of them as we go through. But talking about the subject itself of accents, yes, I do agree with this one. I think that the majority of Americans, when they hear a British accent, find it charming, they find it fascinating. Certainly, if you are British and you go over to the US, as soon as you open your mouth, people will automatically be interested in you, and it will be a very quick icebreaker. I think you'll make friends easily. I do want to add in a caveat though. And that is the idea that American women will swoon for a British accent. And I think that's only true for some British accents. So, Irish and Scottish, yes, we love ourselves a good brogue. Welsh, because I think the average American can't actually distinguish between Welsh and English, as insulting as that may be, given what the English did to you. I'm sorry, Wales. It's just a matter of them not having been exposed enough to be able to distinguish. And to be fair, it's really similar to the way that a lot of British people can't distinguish between an Australian and New Zealand accent, or even a Canadian and like Northern American, like Northern, like United States accents. So don't take it personally. But in terms of English accents, we're really just talking about received pronunciation. I don't think that a lot of American women are really looking for a Cockney or Scouse or Geordie accent, for example. So if you're a bloke from the UK and you're hoping to maybe woo an American woman, don't assume that just because you have any old UK accent that you have an advantage, because that's not necessarily the case. Number two, the obsession with royalty. For most Americans, yes, I agree with this. We know that I personally don't find the whole royal family monarchy thing charming, but yes, I think a bulk of Americans, it's true. They do like to read about, the gossip surrounding whatever shirt tail cousin is up to whatever, or watching episodes of The Crown, or certainly you know, Americans really liked watching televised weddings of, William and Kate and Harry and Meghan. And I think especially now with Meghan Markle, there's even more kind of interest in the royal family because there is that dynamic of, well, how are they treating our homegirl? But even prior to that, obviously, yeah, lots of Americans certainly kind of really interested, fascinated in the monarchy. Again, I personally am not, but I think that it does belong on this list for the average American. Number three, our stiff upper lip. No. And this was on the previous list of things that people find annoying about Britain. So I don't understand why it was included on this list. And this isn't the only case of that happening. We'll run into this later on as well. So I'll just try to quickly repeat what I said in the previous video when this came up, and that is to say that, first of all, I don't think that British people have a particularly stiff upper lip. That was maybe true, 2 or 3 generations ago with, the boomers, or even prior to that, the silent generation during the war. But today, I don't think that's really that true. And the other thing is that I don't think it's uniquely British. This writer says Americans are bemused by our stoic, keep calm and carry on attitude. And that's not true at all. Americans are not confused by stoicism. There are plenty of Americans that are stoic Again, I might do a video about how my particular sort of subculture in the Midwest is very similar to sort of what the stereotype is of British culture. And part of that is that, like, Midwestern US, very stoic. It's not confusing to us, and we also don't find it charming. Why would we? Why would we find like emotional, like constipation, charming? So no, that does not belong on this list. Number four, the art of understatement. That is not something that Americans are going to point to as a British thing. If you stop Americans in the street and you ask them, what are some of the traits about the British that are charming? What is it that you like about the British? I don't think you would ever run across someone who says, oh, they're really good at understatement. That would never occur to an American to say. And even as someone who like has been living here for nearly 2 years now, I've never come away from a conversation with a Brit and just thought, yeah, these guys are the kings of understatement. I don't think it's a particularly British thing. I haven't noticed it to the extent that you would say, oh, yeah, that's a British thing. Again, like the stiff upper lip, it's also not unique. There are plenty of people in the States that use understatement. I did it all the time with my students. It's sort of an offshoot of sarcasm, and that's another thing that I know people will sometimes bring up is that like the British are sarcastic and Americans don't get that. And it's like, have you ever met an American? It was like a lot of us are just like dripping with sarcasm. So I don't. I really don't understand why this is on this list because it's it's such a non thing. It's not even, I don't think, something that people would think of as a stereotype of Britons, let alone something that is actually accurate. Um, yeah, I think, I don't know, I think this writer just maybe threw some things in here to pad out the list. Number five, love for the underdog. This is a really interesting sort of topic to talk about when talking about Americans versus Brits. And so I probably will spend a little bit more time talking about this particular entry. I've seen people bring this up when they're talking about the difference between American humor and British humor is this like British love for the underdog. And that oftentimes in British humor, the protagonist is someone who is sort of like this hapless fellow who like always has like bad things happening to him and that's it, right? Like that's the end of this of the episode is like things don't work out for this guy and that's what's funny. So think, Basil Fawlty in Fawlty Towers. Whereas Americans, it tends to be that, the protagonist sort of wins out in the end. Um and so in that sense it is true. But it is an important, I think, nuance to keep in mind because if you were talking to the average American and you brought up like a love for the underdog, Americans would say that we love an underdog. So we wouldn't necessarily think of it as a British trait. The difference is that Americans want our underdog to then win, right? That is the American dream. The American dream is an underdog. It's someone who comes from nothing, who is from the lower classes or from some sort of group that is an outsider, an immigrant, and they come and they're scrappy and they're perseverant and they work hard and then they like make something of themselves and they are a success. It's a Cinderella story. We want the underdog to then prevail. And that's, every Hollywood plot, right? It's the dorky girl that gets picked on by the popular girls at school, but then she, removes her glasses and plucks her eyebrows and suddenly she's gorgeous and she's going to prom with the high school quarterback or whatever. Or it's the scene in Pretty Woman where Julia Roberts goes back to the high-end fashion store and with wads of cash and is like, you made a big mistake by not waiting on me yesterday. So Americans, when you talk about underdog, they would say like, no, we love an underdog, right? It's just that we want our underdog to win, whereas the Brits are more comfortable with underdogs that they know are not going to win. And that's because they so often themselves are the underdog. You just look at soccer and how they can't ever bring the cup home. Sorry, guys. Um, But even then, you're still going to find that in America, there are plenty of Americans that cheer for a sports team that like disappoints them season after season. I mean, I'm from Michigan and we cheer for the Lions, and every season, right, we get let down because, we're not bringing home any Super Bowl rings. But um, because of that, because there is such a, Americans would say they love an underdog. And even when you are talking, again, like I said, about still cheering for people that aren't going to win, there's enough of that in America that we are not going to look across the pond and see that as a particularly um, unique or noticeable thing among Brits. This is another entry where if you stop someone on the streets of America and ask them, what do you like about Britain? They're not going to say, oh, they love an underdog. It's not going to come up. I mean, in terms of whether it's charming or not, yeah, it is. It's a good thing. It's just not something that, again, is on Americans' radar. Number 6, our political farce. Now, when I read that, I agreed. But then when I read what they wrote about it, they're talking about something else than what I have in mind. They write, from Brexit to our ever spinning political merry-go-round, Americans watch the spectacle of British politics somewhat gratefully. It makes their own political dramas seem a tad less chaotic. I don't know how you can be looking at what's going on in American politics and has been going on in the American political scene for the last, 8 years or so, and think that we would ever look at what's happening in Britain and find it less chaotic. Um, when they said political farce, what I thought they were talking about is the fact that you have satirical candidates like Count Binface. And I absolutely love Count Binface. He's great. And I love that you have to give him airtime on the BBC and that your newspapers will, have little articles about him. And it's not just him. You have plenty of other similar sort of satirical candidates running throughout the country. Um, but I was not aware of that until I came over here. That kind of thing doesn't make it across the pond in the news. Like, Americans back home do not know about Count Binface. Um, but what I like about Count Binface, besides the fact that he's satirical and everybody loves a good satire and loves that you're sort of taking the piss out of like more serious candidates, is that in addition to him, you have serious third party candidates that actually get elected. And so I don't view the British political, system as a farce. I view it as something to be not entirely adopted, because I do think the fact that you had 3 prime ministers in a year, yeah, that's a bit of a farce. That's not something that I think is a good thing. But in general, the fact that you have managed to have a system in place where people from third parties can and do get elected. I understand that when you're talking about the prime minister, it pretty much is a two-party system. But you have MPs from other parties, and that doesn't happen in the States. We have other parties. We have a Green Party, for example, but there's never been a US senator or representative from the Green Party or any party, except, occasionally you'll get like one independent. But for the most part, it is just Republicans and Democrats. And currently, I believe it is all just Republicans and Democrats in the US Congress. And that is a shame. There needs to be room for people from other parties. And so, when the election was happening here, I was just eating it up. I kept all of the flyers that got put in my mailbox from all these different political parties, because it was just so fascinating to me that you had so many that were actually sending out publications. In the States, again, they exist, but you're never going to get a flyer in your mailbox from like the Green Party or whatever. And then that they get elected. So I kept the copy of the Evening Standard that had a color coded map of which counties went to which parties for parliament. And I'm actually going to just show it here for a second for my American viewers so you can see. So you can see all of the different colors, and this is a list, right, of all of the different parties that got elected to positions in Parliament And that is so refreshing to see. It would be great to see that happen in the US. I don't know that there's much chance of that happening, but when I read political farce, if you're talking about the fact that you do have candidates like Count Binface and you are able to have a sense of humor um, about politics here in a way that we don't in the States, then yes. But if you're referring to your entire political system as a farce and think that we're looking at it um, with a through the lens of like, oh man, look at these guys, that's we're aren't we glad we don't have that? That's really off the mark. I think that a lot of Americans are really frustrated with the two-party system and would find a system that allows for third party candidates to actually hold office at the national level to be quite refreshing. And then 7, the class system. No. So this is another thing that was on the annoying list, and I don't understand why it's on this list. It mentions Downton Abbey as though we view the class system through a Downton Abbey lens, like that it's somehow charming. And Americans do not find your class system charming. We like to think of ourselves as a meritocracy. We're not, but we like to think of ourselves that way. And certainly we do function more as one than I think the UK does in terms of upward social mobility and those sorts of opportunities. It's not as good as it should be. It's not as good as we like to think that it is, but I think it is better. Um, and the idea that we can't distinguish between the romanticized version that is Downton Abbey and reality is like saying someone who watches, movies set in the Middle Ages doesn't understand that living in the Middle Ages wouldn't be great, right? Like, no one's, just as we are not watching, Lord of the Rings or something and thinking, like, oh, I'd love to, or Robin Hood and thinking, I'd love to live during that day. Wouldn't it be so great? No, we understand that in reality, we would have a much lower lifespan. There'd be terrible personal hygiene, dysentery, the plague, et cetera, et cetera. We also understand that, like, Downton Abbey, it's only charming if you're a member of the, nobility or upper class. It's not charming for anybody else. And understand that it's not a good thing. And nobody in America is looking across the pond at Britain and thinking, I wish we had that class system. That's so charming. So I don't understand why you would put that on this list, except I think that the writer is, well, I think the writer's a little lazy and they just Googled a bunch of British stereotypes, but we'll maybe discuss that more in subsequent videos. But that is number 7. So stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 when we finish up this list. In the meantime, like and subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.